Welcome to the Public Policy Forum's Disinformation in the Time of Pandemic Expert Roundtable. Je suis ravi que vous soyez joints nous aujourd'hui. So I'm really quite excited about this report and panel today. As many of you, or some of you may know, I come from the world of journalism and therefore, like many of you, but from different places, have an abiding respect for the need of truth and trust in society, for a democratic society to function well, and the standards and systems that enable that to happen. I'm also particularly delighted because I have personal knowledge of the quality of our panelists. Chris Dornan, author of the report, is a longtime friend and a former classmate. Andre Picard is not only one of my most esteemed former colleagues at the Globe and Mail, but more importantly, like me, a disciple of the Montreal Canadiens and their late great captain, Jean Beliveau. So if you wonder where Andre's values come from, I suspect that's where they come from. And Linda Solomon Wood is someone who I know through a lot of association over the last several years, who climbs mountains every day working to build a great new journalistic organization in this country. And although I don't know Dr. Samantha Hill personally, I was very impressed by her appearance recently on TV Ontario and the knowledge that she has of subject matter on the agenda. And my mother always says that you can't know enough cardiac surgeons. I don't know why she says that, but something about the family history, I guess. So anyhow, thank you all for being with us today. PPF is an independent, nonpartisan, non-ideological think tank that focuses on applied policy. Although my kids think pragmatism is boring, we nonetheless work with our members and our partners, a group that ranges from federal government departments and agencies to every provincial and territorial government in the country, to corporations, labor unions, universities and colleges, indigenous groups and associations on coming up with practical policy pathways to make for a better Canada. We bring together thinkers, doers, and deciders in a process we call inclusion to conclusion. And by that, we mean we try to get a good representation of people up front with a reasonable degree of tension in the room, and with the hope of coming up with some fresh policy thinking and conclusions. So being pragmatic is not nearly as boring as being repetitive and irrelevant. So we are trying to say new things to issues, and of course we have a lot of new issues in front of us, so that makes it a fair bit easier. As we were updating our strategy a year ago, we were struck that there's not enough think tanks who were working on the really big challenges coming at us, and we had three in particular that struck us. One was geopolitical change, a second was climate and energy change, and third was technological change. And we look at the latter one in the context of the future of work, now becoming the present of work with what has occurred over the last little while. So we actually have our annual Brave New Work conference that occurs next week, June 16th to 18th, and we hope you'll have a look at our site for that. We also look at what policy needs to do to keep up with an AI world and how Canada needs to be competitive in this intangibles economy. And we spend a lot of time on the interaction among technology, information, and democracy, and have done a lot of work in there. Democracy, of course, is about more than elections. It's about how societies create a foundation of social cohesion and trust to have difficult conversations with one another, and how we agree to disagree is one of the great challenges of our times, I think. Our information democracy work began exactly 4 years ago, before the 2016 US presidential election, when we began to do roundtables and research that led to a report called The Shattered Mirror: News, Democracy, and Truth in the Digital Age. That led to another report called Democracy Divided: Countering Disinformation and Hate in the New Digital Sphere, which laid out a series of potential policy options, while saying the debate wasn't really mature enough yet to settle on them. And now we've created the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression to consider the issues swirling around disinformation and hate and what to do about the quality of our democratic discourse. And I'm happy that some of the 7 commissioners are with us today. This particular research project that we're gathered to discuss today grows out of several conversations that started last fall, long before COVID, around anti-vaxxers and other instances of scientific denial. And then came COVID-19 and the infodemic to exacerbate the pre-existing challenge disinformation was posing to public health and public safety. So disinformation, from our point of view, is an attack on public confidence by purveyors of fear and uncertainty. Sometimes it's out of ignorance. Sometimes it's out of willfulness. In any way, it leads to offline consequences. I just do want to say, though, that this is in the context of the internet being a boon to humankind. We can think of what we know today about the patterns of killings of young Black men that we would not have known if not for this medium. And we can think of the Me Too movement, which was a great collaboration between professional journalism and established news media and the openness of the internet. So, what we want to do, from a public policy foreign point of view, is not get rid of the internet, not shut down the internet, not inhibit the internet, but the pollution that is undermining its utility to society. And that is something we put on the shoulders of our Democratic Expression Commission. So before I hand the virtual mic over to Linda to moderate the panel, I want to thank our project sponsors, Johnson & Johnson, Health Canada, Facebook Canada, NSERC, and the Canadian Institute of Health Information. That's the kind of mix of backers that PPF truly appreciates. And now then, over to our moderator, Linda. Linda is the founder and editor-in-chief of the National Observer, a digital native publication that adheres to the classic values of journalism and journalistic standards. Linda, all yours.
Thank you so much, Ed. And good afternoon, everyone, if you're in the East. If you're in the West, good morning. I'm going to tell you now about our panelists. Christopher Dornan is a professor in the School of Journalism and Communication at Carleton University, who holds a degree in the history and philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge and a doctorate in science communication from McGill University. His latest work includes the reflection paper, Disinformation, the past, present, and future of fake news. I hope I got that right, Chris. Written for the Canadian Commission for UNESCO and how to navigate an information media environment awash in manipulation, falsehood, hysteria, vitriol, hyper-partisan deceit, and pernicious algorithms, a guide for the conscientious citizen. That was written in 2019, and for the Canadian Committee for World Press Freedom and the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. Andre Picard is the health columnist at the Globe and Mail and the author of 5 books, most recently, Matters of Life and Death. And Dr. Samantha Hill is a Toronto-based cardiac surgeon currently working at St. Michael's Hospital and Sunnybrook Health Services Center. Dr. Hill obtained her medical degree from McGill University and holds a Master's of Science, Epidemiology, and Biostatistics from McGill University, and a Master's of Science, Community Health, Health Practitioner Teacher Education from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at University of Toronto. She has held several positions with the Ontario Medical Association and is a recipient of the Fitzgerald Teaching Award in 2017. A single mother of 2 boys, aged 5 and 2, Dr. Hill is a committed environmentalist who believes that one of the most important things we can do as human beings is to take care of the world. Hi, everybody, and welcome. Hi. So Chris, let's start with you. Tell us about the report. Why is it important right now?
Well, because we're in a state of a global crisis, and the attempt to manage that crisis requires communicating clearly and convincingly to the public about what's happening to us all collectively, and what we can do and must do together to address and mitigate this crisis in the best possible interests of everybody concerned. And so that means communicating clearly and convincingly to the public. And that effort is undermined by disinformation that confuses the public, that in some cases invites them to distrust the public health authorities who are doing their best to manage the crisis, and therefore may jeopardize the public health response to the pandemic. So I think we're all aware now of the quite bewildering and quite flabbergasting range of disinformation and misinformation that's kind of polluted the information environment as a result of the pandemic. And this is not surprising. People in a state of concern, anxiety, worry are going to clutch for any source of information that might give them sort of succor or calm their anxieties. So one of the things the paper does is that it actually tries to parse the different types of misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing. And some of it is actually quite benign. It's just people sort of sharing rumors that may be unfounded, but they're not doing kind of pernicious damage to the public health response. Other forms of disinformation are quite calculated, and they may be calculated on the part of foreign actors who are acting out of malevolence, who want to cause difficulties. Other forms of disinformation may be genuinely felt and genuinely believed, but that nonetheless are injurious to our abilities to manage the crisis sensibly. And so more than that, the paper argues that persistent misrepresentations of science and the celebration of scientific falsity, it's not just that things that are false, that are wrong, are circulating in the information environment. It's that this type of disinformation, this kind of species of disinformation, attacks the principles of reason that provide the foundation for sound public policy and rational governments. And the harm that this represents is manifest not just in disinformation surrounding the pandemic, but we've seen it also in the anti-vaccination movement and in some responses to climate change. So the paper, on the one hand, tries to identify the different sources of information and kind of categorize them, but it also it points to something that appears to be happening, that a distrust of science seems to have taken on a kind of political coloration in the relatively recent past. We cite a study from ECOS that says that about 5 years ago, people who identified themselves as liberals and people who identified themselves as conservatives expressed basically the same levels of confidence and trust in the scientific enterprise. That something seems to have happened in the past 5 years that in which a distrust or dismissal of science seems to be more a feature of the right than the left. Although the paper is also careful to point out that it's not a matter of a simple binary opposition. That there are people who would identify themselves on the left who are hesitant or distrustful of vaccination, for example. So you get people on different wave bands of the political spectrum sort of finding themselves in common cause against what they see as a kind of technocratic class. The paper also points out that really what we're grappling with here is part of a much larger issue, and probably one of the thorniest issues of our time, which is freedom of expression, which is a value that in a liberal democracy is of the utmost priority. But that promise of freedom of expression colliding with the need to protect the collective against harm that comes from harmful or malicious or erroneous speech. So I should say also that I thank the Public Policy Forum very much for inviting me to undertake this. I think it's an absolutely fascinating issue of terribly germane, terribly important to the moment in which we live. But the paper is not by any means definitive. The paper it's a discussion paper. It's intended to array a series of facts and map a series of arguments in order to contribute to a conversation that we're now having, that we can harness the expertise of the other panelists and the participants in the roundtable.
Thank you so much, Chris. Andre, does Chris's assessment ring true to you, particularly on the side of how information travels?
Yeah, it does, and especially the part about how it's really changed in recent years, how information has become, especially health information, has become so politicized. Used to be pretty broad agreement across the spectrum, about facts and such things, and now that's not the case. Everything is highly politicized, and I think a lot of this stems from deliberate attacks on the media. There's been this very Trump-like attack to say everything in the media must be wrong, must be questioned. And when you do that, you just create this whole environment of doubt and hatred even, which we see expressed at the Black Lives Matters protests. We see journalists getting attacked. So it's, shoot the messenger has become a literal thing in 2020, and that's frightening.
And Dr. Hill, what about you? How does this relate to what you're seeing in the medical community?
Well, it's absolutely true. And I would add to what Mr. Picard said about it being an attack on media, that there also really does seem to be an attack on science in recent eras. And I think Christopher mentioned it in his report about the perception of scientists as elitists, and that rings true also with doctors and other healthcare professionals often. And the challenge is, particularly in times like this where people are very stressed, that we don't do a great job of training rationality. And when people are stressed, that is even more challenging to do. And so we know that even the greatest minds, when they're put under great stress, leap to reactions and leap to impulse decisions that aren't necessarily evidence-based or sound. And the expectation that our public, who does not have necessarily the amount of scientific training, could avoid that lapse is quite implausible, to be honest. And so I think that for myself, I speak obviously for physicians. I speak specifically for the physicians in Ontario, and our job is really about creating a safe space to have respectful conversations. And we do that all the time, one-to-one with patients. And this is the same conversation that needs to happen at a larger level, where we need to be able to create that safe space and those respectful conversations so that we can allow individuals to make scientifically sound decisions in the face of all of this controversy, in the face of all of this disinformation, and in the face of all of this emotional angst, to be honest. And that's a much more challenging thing to do than it is to just dictate from top down what must be mandated. But we know that mandates don't really work. The public responds to that in a very individualistic manner, and they protect their freedoms very clearly. And so for us as physicians, it's really about how do we best lead the population to make the healthiest, most sound decisions.
Thank you, Dr. Hill. As you guys are saying, disinformation can have impacts on many parts of our society. Chris, what areas and impacts has COVID-19 disinformation had in the short term, in your view?
I think a range of things, as I say, right from people in an anxious state looking for how best to protect themselves against contracting the disease, what to do if they do contract the disease. So we've seen, frankly, crackpot preventative measures or cures being touted from the highest political office in the most powerful country in the world. The suggestion that you could somehow disinfect your body from the inside by presumably ingesting bleach. So you get that type of harm, which is for some of us, you say, oh, this is so easy to dismiss. What a comical claim. And yet, a recent poll conducted by Abacus and Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication shows that 11% of the population actually think that hydroxychloroquine is an effective remedy for the disease or a preventative measure, which is not supported by any scientific literature whatsoever. So you get stuff at that level, the ground level, and all the way up to at the geopolitical level, in which countries are essentially trading false narratives with one another about the origin of the disease, who is therefore to blame for the disease. If only the Chinese had contained this, that it wouldn't have been a problem. The Chinese are to blame. Chinese, meanwhile, manufacturing counter disinformation to the effect that actually it was a creation of an American military lab, etc. So you get this kind of miasma of disinformation that unfortunately cloaks the efforts on the part of responsible health authorities they have to kind of communicate through a fog of lies, if you like. Mm. Which must make, I think somebody will write a completely different paper documenting the public education efforts on the part of public health authorities in Canada and around the world. I think it's a fascinating story to be told about the difficulties of that job.
Yes, for sure. Dr. Hill and Andre, this question is for both of you. How does COVID-19 disinformation stack up against other forms of health and science disinformation? Dr. Hill, if we could start with you.
Sure. So what we've seen with science disinformation is that it's been gaining speed over the last little while. And I know the Ontario Medical Association initially tried to take a stance on this last year or the year before that, when we started to really address vaccine disinformation and the vaccine hesitancy program. Most recently, the attempt has been obviously around coronavirus. Everything's been around coronavirus most recently. And it has been our pleasure and honor to try and stimulate realistic research and information through virusfacts.ca, which is a page that is really directed towards people. It's not directed towards the physicians and not directed towards the government. It's directed towards the voters and the various people who are seeking to be informed, because we operate under the principle that most of the disinformation is not carried around by the malevolent or by those seeking to capitalize on it, but really by the people who are looking for information. And in the absence of information that's easily found, that is loud, that is clear, people create their own information and they create their own stories. One of the things that has been absolutely interesting to me as an epidemiologist to watch and to understand is the concept that in science and in scientific research, we don't talk about facts as much as people do outside of science. We talk about theories and we talk about the pursuit of knowledge. And it's very well understood in both science and medicine that where we stand now and what we believe to be now is our best understanding. And that 20 years from now, if nothing's changed, we're probably not doing our jobs right, because we should be constantly building on it and constantly expanding that knowledge. And one of the things that we use to describe this pursuit is validity. And there's lots of different kinds of validity. Anyone who's worked in research can talk to you about face validity and construct validity and internal, external validity. And they're all just ways of measuring how well you're capturing what you're intending to capture versus the noise versus misconstrued elements around it. And the easiest one for every person in a room to understand is face validity. And what that is how much does what this looks like match what you expected it to look like? Which, if you flip that on its side, is really just how much is this a bias and a confirmation bias. And it's really interesting. So from a science perspective, we always talk about face validity having the lowest scientific rigor. It's not quantified, it's not measured. It's what you get when you ask a crowd full of people, yeah, is this what you expected to see? But it's also the most palatable to people who aren't scientifically trained. It's the one that's most instinctive, and it's the one that's easiest to understand. And so as we move forward, we're really going to have meaningful conversations about how we instruct or work around the concept of face validity, because we know fully well that just because something has face validity or is presumed and believed to be true doesn't mean that it has scientific rigor.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Andre, can you comment, please?
I think, you know, there's disinformation in all kinds of areas. I think what's different about COVID-19 is just it's obsessing everyone. So it's magnifying the impact of the disinformation. So just a very practical one is the hydroxychloroquine. The fact that this been being touted without any scientific backup had a real appreciable harm on people who the drug could benefit. So you see people with rheumatoid arthritis not being able to get their drug. There's real harm coming from this. So if people believe that, you know, blueberries are going to make them live forever, there's not really any harm from that. They can stuff themselves with blueberries and that's fine. But when they start denying their beliefs, deny drugs to other people and actually put their lives at risk, that becomes a big problem. Similarly, if people start believing that this is a hoax, well, I'm going to go out, I'm not going to social distance, and they're going to spread illness. That has a practical harm to it. So that's what concerns me most about the disinformation and the politicization, is that it has a real harm on real people.
For sure. As Ed mentioned in his opening remarks, disinformation may have impacts on our democracy as well. Chris, can you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, they certainly as disinformation, as we currently understand it, you know, came to our attention. It came from the political realm, and it came specifically from the 2016 U.S. presidential election, when it was obvious that there were malign actors who were polluting the information ecosystem with falsities for political ends. And you know, in the run-up to our last federal election, the Canadian government was very concerned about the processes of a democratic election being subverted by or undermined by malign actors. So you know, there are clear threats, menaces to democratic processes around things like elections, but it's also, you know, democracy doesn't consist solely of a periodic, you know, exercise of the franchise at the polling station. Democracy is basically one big, noisome, roiling, fractious debate. It's an argument, it's an ongoing argument about where our priorities should lie, and you know, what values we should pursue as a society. And you know, in the absence of that conversation, the franchise at the polling station is meaningless. I mean, you absolutely have to have in a free society an untrammeled sphere of public expression. But if that conversation of democracy gets hijacked by malevolent falsehoods, then basically democracy becomes sort of illusory. It looks as though you've got a democracy, but in fact, we're coming to decisions as a collective that are false, erroneous, that have been that have been basically suborned by interests that we don't recognize. As I say, this is the problem of disinformation around COVID-19 is very real. It's pertinent, and it's of the moment. But it's really just a part of a much, much larger problem that we must face as free societies.
Thank you, Chris. That was an amazing comment that you just made. Democracy is an ongoing argument. That is some really good food for thought on that. And Andre, in the paper, Chris unfolds a piece of disinformation which he titled Blame Canada. This details the entire part of this piece of disinformation, from a small outline of a journal in India to mainstream news in the United States. As a journalist, what do you think of this, and how do you deal with disinformation?
Yeah, so it's the problem is, so you have this theory floated out there that, well, this virus actually came from the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg. And then if you look at it, there's a lot of facts in there, but then they're just tied together in kind of a dubious fashion. So as a journalist, the headline catches your eye. Oh, how did this come from the National Microbiology Lab? And then when you dig into it a bit, you just see that, well, it kind of falls apart, right? It's just this house of cards, and you realize, no, this isn't credible in any way. But what's really difficult is because there is a lot of facts in there that are true, but it's the way that they're linked together. So as a journalist, we struggle with this. What do? Do you just ignore it? And I think that's what we do most of the time, because it's just, so hard to disentangle. So you just ignore it altogether, or do you wade into it and you try to debunk it? And I think we struggle with that all the time. Do you debunk? Do you ignore? And we do it, I don't think in any logical manner. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And I think we have to think that through a lot more. I always come back to, I think almost for my generation, it's too late. But I think for younger people, we really have to get them young in the education system and teach them the difference between truth and untruth and where information comes from. I'm from the pre-internet era. We didn't have to figure this stuff out. And the most gullible people, we know that, are in my age demographic, right? We're the most likely to retweet total nonsense because we don't think it through. So I do have some hope that I know my children are much more savvy about this, much more thoughtful about it, but we have to give them the tools to do that.
As really, when I think of health reporter in Canada, I think of you. And as the leading health reporter in Canada, I would say, I'm really interested if you could just unpack a little bit more for us. How do you decide whether to just debunk something or ignore it?
Yeah, I think it's almost comes down to a gut reaction. So I wish I had a more scientific answer, but I don't. And I've had this internal debate for many years about anti-vaxxers. So the philosophy for many years was ignore anti-vaxxers. But then when this platform called the internet came along and they had a huge megaphone, you couldn't afford to ignore them anymore. So I kind of switched sides and became you have to confront them, and you have to confront it over and over and fight them, one-on-one every little bit. With COVID, we do a little bit of it, but it gets so much into the political realm that it becomes more difficult to debunk, because then you get lumped in. If you say something against Trump, therefore you're anti-Trump, as opposed to being anti-nonsense or anti-lies.
It's really challenging. And Dr. Hill, what about on the medical side? How are doctors and healthcare professionals dealing with disinformation on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so very much like what Andre was saying, for years we basically tried to ignore it. The idea being that the more attention you spent on it, the more you amplified the message, the more you polarized the community. And we would deal with it one-on-one in offices with patients as parents came in hesitant to vaccinate, or as they had issues with their school board around their vaccination, those kinds of conversations. But it is very hard for physicians as a collective to have each of those conversations individually to a community that's really used to receiving their news. I'm sorry, Andre, at this point in like 161 bytes at a time, or a 30-second clip. We talk a lot about how current media and current people are almost everyone has some element of ADD, we jokingly say, right? Because no one sits down and reads the book anymore, very few people. And it's remarkable when you think about the fact that, you know, in so few generations, we've gone from not having easy access to print, to printed media that was the gestalt of what was happening, to radio, to TV, to now social media, and the times and the way that information is conveyed has just changed faster than really any single individual or community could keep up with. And so now I think we're all becoming very clear, physicians, all of the allied healthcare workers, you know, this is not a physician only battle, that not having these conversations lends legitimacy to the claims, and not having these conversations actually makes it harder for the individuals who are having the conversations. And even though it feels a little bit like a malevolent game of whack-a-mole, it's not. It's dealing with patients as they come in, and again, creating that safe space to have respectful conversations to guide people towards making scientifically sound decisions that not only protect them and their family, but also protect the rest of civilization and society.
That's really interesting. What you said there, not having these conversations lends legitimacy to false claims. Well said. So this is really a question for all of you, but first you, Chris, what can we learn from COVID-19 disinformation to apply to other situations?
I think the primary lesson is that the disinformation must be addressed. That if we allow disinformation to circulate unchallenged, then it gains an unearned advantage. And I don't think, you know, there's as much as we might like to somehow, you know, if there was a faucet of disinformation we could turn off, as much as we might like to be able to do so, that's simply not possible. You know, the misinformation, disinformation comes from, well, it comes from everywhere. As I say, it comes, you know, it kind of bubbles up from the populace themselves. It comes from deliberate acts. So they, I mean, they social media platforms and the traditional media of themselves wrestling with, you know, well, what are our duties and obligations in a situation like this? You know, you know, do the social media companies have a responsibility to police the conversations that happen over their platforms, or you know, would that be anathema to the principles of liberal democracy? That you can't have a free society in which the conversation of democracy is dictated by some central player. So I think in lieu of our ability to simply turn off disinformation, we will be required to kind of robustly and forthrightly defend the principles of scientific investigation and reason and rationality when they come under assault. And that means all the time. We're just going to have to commit ourselves to the defense and the promotion of the values and principles on which, you know, peace, order, and good government are actually founded in.
So you're saying we're going to have to commit ourselves as citizens to more engagement as stakeholders in this space?
Yes, but I mean, the wonderful thing about the rise of the social media platforms is how they have engaged a population that, you know, just 20 years ago, in the era of mass media, you know, the companies like the Globe and Mail are just a single centralized source of responsible, conscientious, and reliable information, would speak to an atomized and dispersed audience whose members had very little opportunity to speak back to the Globe and Mail. They could write a letter to the editor, but that was about it, or phone the editor, but that was about it. And they had very little opportunity to talk amongst themselves. So that's all changed, right? So the wonderful thing about the advent of social media is precisely how they have engaged and animated and empowered the greater population. That conversation of democracy is now being conducted by the citizens themselves and not by proxy agencies in the media. So people are already engaged, but I think the trick is we don't know enough about how disinformation actually makes purchase on people's minds and opinions. We don't know enough about the way in which the social conversations are actually being conducted over the social media. So the paper I cite, a recent study in Nature that looked at Facebook groups, those in favor of vaccination, those opposed to vaccination, and both of them supposedly trying to talk to a constituency of people who are undecided. And the paper pointed out that although the pro-vaccination groups were more numerous, they didn't really seem to be engaging with the undecideds. They were talking to themselves, and thinking they had sort of won this public health debate. But in fact, the Nature paper suggests that they may be losing the debate because they're not properly engaged with those who are trying to make up their minds, trying to seek information that would inform the decisions they make for themselves and their families. So, one of the things that the paper recommends is that, a redoubled effort, research effort on how social media actually informs the contemporary conversation.
Thank you. And Dr. Hill, do you agree with the lessons that Chris has sort of brought out here, and how can they be applied in your field?
I do agree with the lessons. I think if I was to think about it independently, I would come up with very similar lenses. One of the major things that I've already referenced is about education and how we need to teach better health literacy, but also better science literacy to the population at large. And maybe that starts in high school, or maybe we need to reach out to adults who are no longer in school somehow. But the rigor and training involved in making well thought out, rational, reason-based decisions is not something that you can acquire during a crisis. And so it has to be in sight prior to the crisis. The other thing that I personally have learned over the last 5 weeks since I've assumed this role, has it only been 5 weeks, is that as a leader who's communicating to the people, transparency has become super critical. Our members and probably the general population can sniff out as soon as you try and avoid a topic. And nature abhors a vacuum, and then they fill that space with ideas. And often those ideas are critical or very suspicious in the space of what you may have been avoiding being just because it was a confusing topic or it wasn't the right space to have that conversation. And what I've seen some of the really best leaders, I think, do in the last little while is just be very forthright with what we do and don't know, and why we do and don't know things. Because it allows us to pivot and change recommendations without it seeming like we're changing our mind. And so the best example for that I can consider is that of masks. When initially we were all saying, no one needs to wear a mask, don't wear a mask. And the reason for that was complex. I mean, part of it was there weren't enough masks for the doctors and nurses in the hospital, and they certainly had to have priority on them. But part of the reason for that was because we were telling people to stay home. And if you were home in your own house, you didn't need a mask. Now that we start to reopen and we're telling people, if you're going to be within 6 feet of each other, you should be wearing a mask. And some people take that a step further and say, just always wear a mask. They're not conflicting messages. They're actually all very much in line with each other, which is first you isolate yourself, and then if you can't isolate yourself, you wear a mask. And if you're not sure you can isolate yourself, you wear a mask. And to me, and to people who have been sort of well informed along the process, it's very clear how it's all the same message. But to my cousin over in another city, she wants to know why it's changed. What's changed about the virus? Why aren't we following the same rules? And were we wrong in the first place? And so I do think that's one of the big lessons that I personally have learned as far as leadership and physician leadership. It's important that we be clear about the process of the medicine and the science.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. And Andre, as a health reporter, and then I'm going to fire this question at Chris as well as our last question. But before that last question, Andre, I wanted to ask you, as a health reporter, what is your takeaway from this conversation on all of this?
Well, I think it's that science and journalism has to be more of a conversation. That's the new world. For a long time, public health in particular would give us decrees. We should do this because we should do it. It was almost like a religion. And people don't accept that anymore. They've taken it too far. They don't believe in any expertise. But we have to be willing to engage. We have to be willing to debate. As Dr. Hill said very importantly, we have to be able to say, I don't know. And you don't lose credibility doing that. Quite the opposite. People respect, yeah, I get it. They know stuff, but they don't know everything. That's the way we have to communicate science in the future, is communicate its uncertainty, its messiness. All that stuff is really important to winning people over. We have to try and counter this polarity of black and white. And that's what science is. Science is never black and white. Health is not black and white. Medicine's not black and white. And we have to learn to communicate that way to adapt to the new medium. We have to have a new way of conveying our messages.
Thank you so much. That's so interesting. Nothing's black and white. And Chris, last comment from you. What's the takeaway for all of us on this call?
That's an excellent question. I'm not sure there is a takeaway. I think that I think the takeaway is that we've got a much larger problem than simply false information about a particular disease. This is, as I said, this is a global crisis. We've never seen anything like this in our lifetimes. But the issues, the anxieties, the falsities that are kind of churning through our information system are not confined to COVID, and they're not confined just to medicine or to science. This is happening in basically every precinct of kind of human existence, from politics to business to personal relations. And so that I think, as unsatisfying and mealy-mouthed as this answer may be, I think the takeaway is that our social circumstances have been changed. They've been changed utterly in the space of less than a lifetime by the advent of new forms of computer-mediated social conversations. And that as a society, we're going to have to come to grips with how to conduct that conversation in a way that is not harmful to our collective interests and the public good.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, Dr. Hill. It's been a pleasure to be with you all today. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you to Andre and Chris and Samantha as well for a really great conversation. I think it used to be a lot easier, as everybody on the panel said. I think those of us who came from a background around information and a kind of liberal ethos that from the Enlightenment on forward, felt that very famous quotation of John Milton's about truth and falsehood grappling, and of course it's not that simple anymore, because they don't necessarily meet on the same playing field to grapple with each other. And as I think we heard from Dr. Hill, and in Chris's paper as well, truth is a process of discovery. It's a dynamic reality. It's not fixed in time, whereas falsehood has a much lower standard that it has to live up to, if you will. And so I think that raises all kinds of very interesting challenges that we have to do. New to me today was fake validity, and so I'm going to have to give some additional thought to fake validity. Great discussion. This discussion will go online, as Katie said earlier, later, and I really want to thank Chris, who's a theorizer of this, Andre, who is kind of a crossover in that he's got to deal with the theories of it, but he's also got to practically be living in an environment in which he's trying to be a truth teller in an environment that is heavily polluted, and Samantha Hill as well now as a leader of a group of physicians and scientists who for whom this is actually a public health nuisance and hazard, as well as being an informational and democracy hazard. So thank you for all, and Linda, finally, thank you very much for your participation. I know that you've had you and the National Observer have had a strong interest in disinformation issues and what we do and what we sort out, how we sort them through them. You've done a lot of work journalistically on that, and I commend that to everyone in the audience.